Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And we're continuing our series on the trees of Eastman today. Today, we're going to talk about oaks. The trees and forests, are the heart and soul of Eastman. The Eastman's founders designed this community to live within the natural beauty and the features of the land. Our trees don't just provide us with shade, they provide life, not only for us, but also for much wildlife. They provide roosting and nesting habitats for both birds and many mammal species. Their wood, branches, leaves, nuts, and seeds provide a food source for many wildlife species. And you may not recognize the millions of caterpillars that feast on tree leaves and in turn become prime food sources for fledgling birds. Woodpeckers feast upon the insects in many of the dying trees, and trees provide shelter from the elements for many of our wildlife species. Trees are also carbon sinks that fight global warming and climate change. And even in death, trees provide new life to emerge. So, in a word, trees are Eastman. Again, every tree at Eastman has its own role. Each one has an influence on other trees and plants, and each one has an impact on our wildlife. But there's one tree that truly stands out amongst all the rest, and that's the mighty oak. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Oak trees, again, are keystone species. That means they have a widespread impact on our ecology. We have both white oaks and red oaks here at Eastman, but red oaks are much more frequent. The red oaks are faster growing and they're less shade tolerant. The slower growing white oaks have stronger wood and live much longer. Both produce acorns, which are one of the most important food sources for over 200 wildlife species. And moreover, the cyclical pattern or of production of acorns lead to some very surprising fluctuations in our wildlife patterns. Acorns, again, are a form of hard mast, and as an important food source for so many wildlife species, you may want to see our separate presentation on hard mast for a detailed discussion about acorns. Uh, Acorns, particularly the white oak, is relatively rot resistant and waterproof. So historically, it's been used in shipbuilding. It's also used in storing liquids, such as in wine casks or whiskey barrels. So acorns do have some, or, I'm sorry, oaks do have some commercial value, but the real value of oaks is for our wildlife. So oaks are disappearing. Uh, Forests in the eastern US have become increasingly dominated by maples, birch, and hemlock, really at the expense of oaks. And suppression of fires has been suggested as one reason for that decrease in oak regeneration. Oaks grow relatively rapidly and need lots of sunlight, and they also need the right mineral rich soil. So, conditions after a fire are often ideal for oak regeneration. Fallen oak leaves that are very dry and have curled edges also promote fires. And oak saplings have very strong root systems. So fire may destroy the sapling above the ground, but the root system may lead to regeneration of the oaks. Massachusetts, interestingly, actually uses prescribed fires to promote more oak growth, given the value of the oaks for wildlife. And thinning of the forest canopy can also provide more sunlight, so oak saplings are able to grow. Several things help us identify oak trees. First of all is the branching pattern. So the pattern is an alternate branching pattern as opposed to the opposite branching pattern that we'd see with maples or ash trees. The leaf pattern is simple, 5 or 6 deep rounded lobes and short stalks for the white oak, and 7 to 11 pointed lobes for red oaks. The bark tends to be smooth when the trees are young, but becomes fissured with rough platelets in more mature trees. And the leaves may be marcescent in the fall and winter. That means that the trees actually keep their leaves throughout the winter when most of the other trees have lost their leaves. And of course, the acorns help us differentiate the various species. This is showing an oak branch. Oak branches and buds have an alternating branching pattern. So here you see a branch here and over here, and that's different from the opposite branching pattern that we might see again with maples or ash trees. This is a winter twig from an oak tree, and it's smooth and relatively silvery and has lots of brown buds that tend to be concentrated at the tips. This is showing the leaf pattern. White oak leaves, again, are longer than they are wide. They usually have 5 to 6 lobes. They're rounded, and they have very short stalks. The leaves first emerge usually in mid-May, and they turn a yellow-brown in autumn. And some oaks keep their leaves through the winter. That's called marcescence, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. Red oak leaves, on the other hand, are again longer than they are wide, but they have pointed lobes and they have tiny bristles or hairs at the tip of each lobe. So again, these are pointed here. And this one, you can actually see the little bristle or this little hair that sticks out at each of those pointed lobes. And there are typically 7 to 11 lobes. And the red oak leaves may be red or orange or russet in the fall. This is obviously a fall color of this leaf. And some red oaks also keep their leaves in winter. Once again, that's called marcescence. So again, marcescence means that some trees don't drop all their leaves in the fall. And the leaves turn from green to a tan or a yellow or brown, but they remain attached to the branches throughout the winter. This is called marcescence. And again, there are really only several species of trees that have marcescent leaves. Those are beech, oak, witch hazel, hornbeam, and hop hornbeam. So that actually helps us identify trees in the winter. Basically, if you see leaves on the tree in winter, it's only one of those 5 species. And this is showing some oak leaves that have persisted on the trees in the fall. Younger trees are actually more likely to be affected. And these again are a good clue to tree identification in winter. So why do some trees not drop all their leaves in the fall? Well, there are lots of theories. We're not going to go through all of them. Really, the most important one is that it's probably to protect the new buds from being eaten by browsing fauna during winter. That's probably the best guess. And one interesting fact, we don't know if this is fact or myth, in the Ice Age, giant ground sloths were about 20 feet tall, and they would browse the trees up to 20 feet. So again, if you look at trees that are marcescent, typically it's the leaves down low that have been persistent, and the branches up above have already lost their leaves. So again, interesting fact. So again, red oak versus white oak. How do we make the distinction? The white oaks have these soft, rounded edges, whereas red oaks have these pointy edges and they have these little bristles that come out. White oaks also have a flakier bark. I'll show you the bark in a minute. White oaks also grow much more slowly, and as a result, they become much bigger than the red oaks. And the acorns of the red oaks are shorter and flatter, and they tend to mature every 2 years compared to every 1 year for white oak acorns. So this is looking at the bark. The top shows white oak bark. It tends to be a whitish gray, a lighter color, and particularly up higher on the tree, it has a very flaky appearance. And I'll talk about why that may be important later on. And the bottom is red oak bark. It's darker, it has long, flat ridges. And some people have described them as being ski trails because if you trace one of these ridges all the way down, it's unbroken, goes all the way down like a long ski trail. Very interesting. White oak bark tends to be flakier higher up on the tree, especially on one side. And bats can actually roost under some of that bark. Very interesting. It's one of the few live trees that bats can roost in. Okay, here are the acorns. Okay, the top are white oak acorns. Again, they tend to be larger and oblong, and they have this thick bowl-shaped cap. On the other hand, the red oak acorns on the bottom are shorter and fatter, and they have a scaly cap that looks like either a bottle cap or a little beret. And the red oak acorns have a higher tannin content. They also drop earlier and last longer in the season. That tannin content is important. Tannins have a very bitter taste, so white-tailed deer and most other species that feed on the acorns actually prefer white oak acorns in preference to red oak acorns. So again, the mighty oak is a keystone species. A keystone in if you remember in architecture is a wedge-shaped block that basically holds up an arch. And if you remove that keystone, the entire structure crumbles. So the analogy applies to ecological systems as well. Changes to a keystone will affect the whole much broader ecology. And there's several biological keystones that we've talked about. Beavers almost anywhere, salmon in Alaska, elephants in the savannah, and wolves in Yellowstone. Those are all examples of biological keystones. And is the oak a keystone species? Absolutely. Okay, the oak trees are definitely a keystone species because they're critical for the ecology of the forest and for the wildlife that lives in our forest. An oak tree can live for hundreds of years and can actually produce about 3 million acorns over a lifetime. So think about all the animals it can feed over that lifetime. Uh, the oaks provide an essential food for dozens of bird species, such as jays, woodpeckers, turkeys, and also many mammals, bears, deers, raccoon, opossums, rodents like squirrels and mice, insects like weevils. And oak leaves feed the caterpillars of over 500 species of moth and butterfly. And those caterpillars, in turn, become very rich because they're very rich in protein and lipids, are a critical food source for birds feeding their young so that those young birds can grow and develop. And oaks are important for building ships, homes, and furniture as well. Oaks are also involved in a very famous trophic cascade. And let me describe this. It's an interesting story. So you have an acorn that grows into an oak tree. That oak tree grows and it sheds more acorns. An acorn falls to the ground. An acorn weevil finds that acorn on the ground, drills a hole in it, and removes the insides. Well, acorn ants then move into that hollow acorn and they propagate. And those ants then live aside aphids on various plants. The aphids feed on the sap of the plants and they secrete a very sweet liquid known as honeydew. The ants are drawn to that sugar rich substance and they harvest it as a food source. But in return, the ants provide protection of the aphids from predators like ladybugs. And ultimately, the larva of the harvester butterfly will feed on the aphids. And of course, the harvester butterfly emerges from that caterpillar. And it's quite a journey from an acorn to a butterfly. That's what's known as a trophic cascade. This picture actually shows all three of those elements. Here you see aphids, which are secreting honeydew. Here are the ants, which again are protecting the aphids and loving the honeydew that's secreted by the aphids. And then you see this larva, the caterpillar of the harvester butterfly, which eventually is going to eat these aphids. Very interesting trophic cascade. Okay, so here are the acorns. The acorns are the nuts that are produced by the oak trees, and they're a key food source for multiple wildlife species in fall, probably over 200 species in all. And the interesting fact is that acorn production is cyclical, and that cyclicality has incredible implications for our wildlife. More on that later. So the acorns are critical food sources. They contain large amounts of protein, carbohydrates, and fat. So they're really excellent choices for wildlife, particularly as the wildlife are preparing for winter. So the acorns typically drop from the oak trees in the fall, and that's the time that the wildlife is trying to fatten up and create energy sources and stores that are going to last throughout the winter. Acorns are also good sources for minerals like calcium, phosphorus, and potassium, and probably some vitamins like niacin. And the total energy content of an acorn does vary by species, but all compare fairly well to the other wild foods and other nut sources. But the acorns also contain tannins, and I mentioned tannins are very bitter and can have unwanted side effects on animals. So most animals will prefer the sweeter white oak acorns because they have a lower tannin content than the red oak acorns. But red oak acorns both fall off the trees earlier and they tend to last longer. So they may become a primary source of food later in the fall and throughout the winter. Acorns get disseminated often by animals. Some animals, like squirrels and jays, actually cache the acorns. And they may wait for groundwater to percolate through the acorns, which tends to remove the tannins before they actually eat them. Different squirrel species cache acorns differently. Again, red squirrels tend to have a single cache, whereas the gray squirrels tend to have multiple caches. And because acorns are too heavy to be dispersed by wind, it's really dispersal as seeds by the squirrels and jays that leads to new oak trees. When the squirrels and jays are caching their acorns, they're going to lose some of them. And those lost ones may, in fact, germinate into new oak trees. And actually, many cached acorns are also never found. So eventually, they may sprout into oak trees. This is showing squirrels and jays caching the acorns. And again, they're going to drop some of these acorns, and hopefully those will germinate into oak trees. And sometimes they actually forget where they cached some of those acorns. So hopefully those acorns will also germinate into oak trees. A key concept is that acorn production is cyclical. Acorn production does vary from year to year in a boom and bust cycle. White oak trees produce acorns roughly 4 out of every 5 years. Red oaks produce acorns every other year. It also takes 2 years for red oak acorns to mature. So that leads to relatively big acorn crops roughly every 4 to 10 years. But the cyclical nature really is an evolutionary asset. Really, trees like oaks are thought to deliberately initiate these cycles to thwart what we call seed predators. So let's give you an example. If they produce few acorns in a year, the population of squirrels and mice is going to drop off the next year. Well, the next year, the trees then produce many acorns, and that's when you have fewer animals around to eat them, that increases the likelihood that some of the new seedlings will be planted and lead to new oak trees. So it really is probably an evolutionary asset. The effect of these boom and bust cycles is really felt throughout the wildlife community. So when they produce few acorns, again, the population of squirrels and mice and voles and other small animals is going to be smaller the next year. But what about the animals that eat those small mammals? So we're talking about red fox, owls, and other species. They also rely on those smaller animals as food sources. So their population is also going to decrease in subsequent years. And the red fox population will be smaller until the population of squirrels and mice increases again. And during a boom year, when there will be lots more mice and squirrels and voles around, you're going to see an increase in the number of raptors and other predators. So a boom year actually has consequences for we humans as well. White-footed mice will increase in number during after a boom year, but that also means that the tick population that feeds on those mice will go up as well. More ticks means more ticks carrying Lyme disease, which means there's going to be an increase in Lyme disease in humans as well. So the impact of the cyclical nature of acorn production really is widespread. So when the cycles collide, remember, it's not just oak trees that have boom and bust cycles. Beech nuts also are produced by beech trees every other year. Beech nuts, obviously, are the other key wildlife food source in the fall. And again, you have beech trees creating beech nuts every other year, white oak trees producing acorns every 5 years. And during when those off cycle years overlap, which historically occurs about every 8 to 12 years, there's going to be a dearth of hard mast out in the forest. Such an overlap of down years occurred here in the fall of 2018, and it was followed by what was called Squirrel Mageddon in 2019. That means a lot of squirrels died off because they didn't have enough acorns or beech nuts to feed on. Moreover, in those doubly down years, the food source for bears dries up, and that sends the bears to hunt in human occupied areas for food. We'll talk about that in a minute. Much of the 2022 increase in bear human interactions that occurred here at Eastman was likely due to that dearth of hard mast in the forest. So, what happened after 2022? In the fall of 2022, bear encounters peaked here at Eastman. And in the fall of 23 and through 2024 and early here in 2025, we've had far few bear encounters. So what happened? Well, Eastman's board did pass some measures like not feeding the bears, bringing bird feeders in early, and securing trash and grills. That undoubtedly had a big impact, but probably the hard mast cycle was at least as important. And 2022 had been a bust year for both acorns and beech nuts, whereas 2023 was a boom year, or what we call a mast year for acorns. So the bears' favorite food in the fall was now plentiful again in the forest, and they had less need to forage near humans. But unfortunately, a few bears learned bad habits and probably passed them on to their cubs. So that's why we still have some bears prowling around looking for food in our backyards. Aside from their value as a primary food source, oaks do provide value to wildlife in other ways. Their leaves and twigs and buds can be used as food sources by various other species. And they do provide shelter and nesting sites for many bird and mammal species, and even some invertebrate species. And again, the caterpillars thrive on oak trees and in turn become a vital food source for many birds, particularly fledgling birds. And the fallen leaves and branches also provide habitat for many different invertebrates like salamanders and other animals. And they provide shade and they fight climate change through carbon sequestration. So we'd really have a much different environment if we didn't have our oak trees. So that's a little bit about oak trees. We hope that you appreciate what oak trees do for us, and hopefully you'll take a look at some of our other videos on the trees of Eastman.